On the 12th morning, the horses came back alone, saddled, supplied, calm. 4 men had ridden into Horn Gap 11 days before. Only the horses returned. Clara Holt saw them from the kitchen window. 2 dark shapes first, then 4, moving down the long slope from the gap at the unhurried pace of animals making their own way. Not driven, not guided. Moving the way horses move when they have decided where they are going and are going there. She knew, before she could see them clearly, that they were saddled. The shape of them was wrong for unmounted animals. She stood at the window and watched them come, and she understood what she was seeing and what she was not seeing, and she did not move for the 10 minutes it took them to cross from the base of the slope to the gate of her property. She understood. The horses had come back. She understood. Her husband had not. She went to the door and put on her coat and went out to them. Her husband's horse, a bay gelding named Tanner that he had owned for 6 years, stood at the gate with the calm, matter-of-fact quality that the horse always had, the steadiness that had made Thomas Holt choose him specifically, because Thomas valued steadiness above almost every other quality in an animal or a person. Tanner looked at her as she came to the gate with the same expression he always had, attentive, patient, entirely without distress. The saddlebags were full. The bedroll was strapped behind the saddle as Thomas had strapped it the morning he left. The rifle in its scabbard on the left side. Everything present. Everything in its place. She opened the gate, and the horses came through, and she stood in the yard with her hand on Tanner's neck and looked at the pass on the ridgeline. She held the last available possibility, that the horses had been separated from the riders by some accident, that the men were on their way back on foot. She held it not because she believed it, but because it was the last thing that was not the other thing. She stood in the yard with her hand on the horse and held it for as long as she could. Then she went to find Gus Merritt. The ridge that Horn Gap cut through was the defining geographic feature of the northern part of the county, a limestone escarpment running east to west for nearly 40 miles, high enough to function as a genuine barrier to movement and steep enough that in most places it was impassable to wagons and difficult even for riders. Horn Gap was the only practical crossing for 20 miles in either direction. A natural break in the limestone, 30 feet wide at its narrowest, a quarter mile from the southern approach to the northern descent. Not dramatic. Not high or vertiginous or obviously dangerous. The road through it was adequate, the rock walls stable, the footing solid in all but the wettest weather. 15 years of regular use, and it had given no one cause for concern. Thomas Holt had ridden through it dozens of times. He knew the ridge and the gap and the country north of it, as well as any man in the settlement. He was not inexperienced. He was not careless. He had ridden into the gap on the morning of November 3rd, 1868, in the company of 3 other men. Gus Merritt's older brother Ned, a man named Cravens who ran cattle on the north side of the ridge and needed to check his operation before winter, and a younger man named Dill who had been in the territory only a year and wanted company on his first crossing. 4 men, 4 horses, enough supplies for a week. They rode into the pass on a clear November morning. They did not come out the other side. Not that morning, not the day after, not in 11 days of Clara watching the pass from her kitchen window, morning and evening and the hours between. These were local men on a familiar route in clear weather. That is the thing that made what happened to them so completely, without the usual explanations. They went into the pass, and they did not come out, and now the horses were in her yard, with the saddlebags full and the bedrolls strapped, and the rifles in their scabbards, and the men who had ridden them were somewhere that the available facts could not account for. Gus Merritt came within the hour. He was a practical man of 45 who had been Thomas Holt's closest friend in the territory for 8 years, and who had been managing his own version of the waiting from his property across the hollow, watching the ridge each day, allowing himself only what hope the absence of news could reasonably support. When Clara told him what had come through the gate, he came to the yard and looked at the horses in the way a man looks at something that confirms 11 days of fear. Not with surprise, with the settling of fear into fact, which has a different weight and is in some ways easier to carry, because it has a specific shape. He checked the horses carefully. No injuries, no evidence of hard going, shoes intact, coats clean. In every physical sense, horses that had been well kept and lightly worked. He and Clara opened the saddlebags and went through them together, laying the contents out on the porch railing. Food, most of it still there, less than a day's consumption gone. Tools, extra ammunition, personal effects, Thomas's journal in the left saddlebag where he always put it. Ned's tobacco pouch, the maps Cravens had brought for the north side route. Everything the men had taken was here. Gus sat on the porch step and looked at the yard and the horses standing in it and the ridgeline beyond. Clara brought coffee. She sat beside him and they looked at the ridge. She said, "You're going into the pass." He said, "I have to," she said. "The horses came back through it from the other side. They went through after whatever happened, and they came home, and they're not distressed. They're just horses that came home." He said, "I know," she said. "Tanner doesn't carry anything. He came through the gate the same way he always comes through the gate." Gus looked at the bay gelding cropping at the frozen grass in the yard, placid, unhurried. He said, "No, he doesn't." He said, "I'll go tomorrow." Early. That night, Clara sat by her fire for a long time after Gus left. She had Thomas's journal in her hands, the familiar worn leather of a cover she had handled hundreds of times. He had kept it for as long as she had known him, 7 volumes since they came to the territory, and this was the 8th, and the habit of it was so thoroughly his that the journal in her hands had the quality of a personal effect more intimate than most. Not clothing or tools, which were practical and transferable, but the record of how a mind moved through its days. She opened it to the last entry. He had written it the evening before he left, as he always did before a journey, a brief accounting of the route, the duration, the people he was traveling with. At the end, "We'll be back by the 10th. Tell Clara I have the tobacco she wanted from the Cravens store." She read this twice. She closed the journal. She sat by the fire for a long time. The search party Gus assembled at first light numbered 6 men. Roper and Dunn, who knew the pass. A man named Birch, who knew the country to the north. 2 brothers named Calloway, who moved toward difficult situations rather than away from them. And a man named Teal, the closest thing the settlement had to a physician. Clara watched them go from the kitchen window. She watched them cross the hollow and climb the long slope toward the gap and go into the pass, and she watched the dark crease in the limestone after they were inside it, and she waited. She had the horses in the barn by then. She fed them and watered them, and they accepted this with the same equanimity they had shown since their return. Tanner eating his grain with the routine contentment of a horse in familiar surroundings, neither of them showing anything she could read as memory of whatever they had been through. She knew horses. She knew what they held and how they held it, knew that a horse that had been through something difficult wore it in its body, in the tension of its muscles and the quality of its alertness. She had seen horses that had survived bad crossings, rough weather, encounters with predators. They were different after, marked, carrying the information of the experience. Tanner was not marked. He was the same horse he had always been, in every quality she could assess. Not blank, not emptied, himself entirely. As though whatever had happened in the pass had happened to Thomas and not to Tanner. As though the pass had taken something specific and left the rest intact. She thought. The pass took the men. It took only the men. The horses passed through it and came home. She thought. Why? She had no answer. Gus's account of what the search party found in Horn Gap was given first to Clara that evening, then to the settlement, then to the county sheriff who arrived 8 days later. Each time he gave it in the same words, because he had settled on them carefully. The pass was empty. Not empty in the way of a place cleared of its contents. Empty in the way of a place that had never contained what you were looking for. The road through the gap was undisturbed. The limestone walls showed no evidence of rockfall, no recent scarring. No sign of camp, no evidence of fire, no personal effects, no indication that 4 men and 4 horses had passed through 11 days ago. They had gone through to the north side and followed the road north for 2 miles. Nothing. They had looked for tracks. The ground inside the gap was mostly rock, but on the south approach they found the prints of horses going in. Old, weathered, but readable. They did not find any prints coming out on either side. There was a place, Gus said, roughly at the midpoint of the east wall. The rock there was the same limestone as the rest of the wall, but it looked different. Not in color, not in texture. Different in the way a mirror looks different from a wall before you recognize what you're looking at. A surface that was what it was and also something else. Clara said, "What do you mean?" He said, "I put my hand on it. The rock was cold, colder than the surrounding rock, with no reason for the differential. Same surface, same exposure, same everything. And when I had my hand on it, I had the feeling I've only had once before, standing at the edge of a drop in the dark, a drop I couldn't see the bottom of. The specific feeling of depth that has no floor." He said, 3 of the men with me were looking at the same section of wall with the same expression I expect I had. We did not discuss it. We finished the search and came back through. Clara said, "The horses came back through it, from the north side, after whatever happened." He said, "Yes," she said. "Then tell me what you think happened. Not what you can prove, what you think." He was quiet for a long time. He said, "I think the gap took them. I think there is something in that wall at the midpoint, in that section of rock that is cold in a way rock shouldn't be cold, and I think when 4 men rode through the gap 11 days ago, that something took them and left the horses." She said, "Why the men and not the horses?" He said, "Whatever is in that wall, it takes people, not animals. I don't know if it's a distinction the thing makes deliberately, or if animals are simply outside its range. But the horses came back and the men didn't. And the only framework I have is that the gap makes a distinction." Clara was very still. She said, "Could they come back? The way the horses came back?" He said, "I don't know." She said, "That means you don't think so." He said, "I won't tell you something I don't know." She said, "No, don't." She looked at the pass in the last of the day's light. She said, "I'll watch the window. In case." He understood it. It was the same thing he was doing in his own way, watching for his brother, and conducting the various procedures of a community, trying to account for what it could not account for. Clara was doing it in the way she did it. At the window, present, available in case. He went home. She stayed at the window. The county sheriff, a methodical man named Aldous Cross, arrived 8 days after Gus's search party. He went into the pass with Gus and Roper and Dunn. He came out and said very little. His report read, 4 men entered Horn Gap on the morning of November 3rd, 1868, bound for the highland country to the north. They did not emerge on the north side. No physical evidence of their passage beyond the Gap's southern entrance was located. No remains, no personal effects, no evidence of accident, animal attack, or foul play were found. Their horses returned to the settlement on November 14th, unsaddled, carrying all supplies and equipment. The circumstances of the men's disappearance are without satisfactory explanation. Investigation ongoing. The investigation was not, in any practical sense, ongoing. Cross returned to the county seat, filed the report, and did not return to the Gap. He was a practical man, and he had stood at the midpoint of Horn Gap with his hand on the cold section of the east wall, and felt what Gus Merritt had felt, and he had decided the Gap was not a place he was going to be useful. A deputy sent the following spring found nothing north of the ridge. No one had seen 4 men in November. The Craven's cattle operation had been found by a neighbor in February. Cattle in poor condition, structures intact, no sign of recent habitation. The men had not come through the other side of the pass. They were in the pass, or in whatever the pass held, or in a place that the available frameworks for describing places could not accommodate. Clara Holt remained on the property. She was 34 years old. She had no children, and she had family in Tennessee who wrote to ask if she would consider coming home. She wrote back to say she would not, at least not yet. The explanation was simple. She was watching the pass, not only from the window. She developed the habit of walking to a low rise on the north end of her property, from which the Gap was visible at a closer distance and at an angle that showed the interior of the pass for perhaps the first 30 feet. She went there every evening in the last hour of light and stood and looked, giving the thing she was looking at time to be itself in her presence. In the spring, she began keeping a record. Not a journal, a record of observations, the quality of the light on the Gap at different times of year, the behavior of animals near it. She noted that animals did not go near the Gap. The game trails in the area all curved away from the ridge at some distance, as though the Gap had a radius of avoidance that the deer and turkey and smaller animals honored without apparent reason. The consistency of it, in all weather and all seasons, with a regularity that suggested not learned behavior, but inherited caution, told her it was old. Older than Thomas's disappearance. Older than the settlement. The animals had always moved around the Gap the way water moved around a stone, because the knowing was built into the movement, inseparable from it, older than any individual animal that carried it. The Gap had always been what it was. She thought about what Gus had said, the distinction. Not between men and horses, she decided. That was the surface of it. Beneath it was something about the specific quality of human forward motion. A horse moving through a gap in a ridge was only moving through a gap in a ridge. A person moving through that same gap was moving through it with everything they had ever been and done and intended pressing forward with them. And the thing in the wall, whatever the cold section of limestone contained or expressed or was, had reached for that weight. For the accumulated weight of people in motion, pressing forward into their futures. She thought about Thomas riding into it on a clear November morning. The particular way he sat a horse, forward, alert, always slightly ahead of where he was in the manner of a man whose mind moved faster than his circumstances. She thought, wherever the past took him, he went into it fully himself. He was not diminished before the taking. He was Thomas Holt, entire, pressing north into the country he knew, and whatever took him took all of that. She did not know if this was comfort. It was the closest she could get to comfort. In the 3rd year, she walked to the entrance of the gap itself. She had watched from the rise, had kept her record, had conducted the long, sustained looking from a distance. In the 3rd year, she decided she was ready to stand at the entrance of the thing she had been watching. She went in the early morning of a clear autumn day, on foot, without telling anyone. The approach from the south was ordinary. The road that climbed the ridge, the limestone walls rising on either side as the gap narrowed, the ambient cold of enclosed stone that had nothing to do with what Gus had described. She walked to the midpoint and stopped. The section of the east wall was there. She had known the description for 3 years. Standing in front of it was different from knowing it. She stood in front of it without touching it, looking at it with the full quality of attention she had been developing. The attention of someone who has made looking into a practice, who has learned to be present to a thing without demanding that it explain itself. Then she put her hand on the wall. The cold was there, immediate and specific. Not the ambient cold of limestone in October, but something underneath it. Something with depth that the surface did not account for. She held her hand there. She felt what Gus had felt, the quality of a drop in the dark, the sense that the surface she was touching was not a boundary, but a threshold, and that what lay beyond it was not empty. She took her hand off the wall. She stood in the gap and she said, not loudly, "I know you have him. I know you took him whole. I have been watching from the window and the rise, and I have been here every evening for 3 years, and I want you to know that. I want whatever is on the other side of this wall to know that someone is still looking in this direction, that he has not been forgotten, that there is someone here who is still present to what happened." She was not certain who she was speaking to, or whether it made any difference. But she had thought, after years of watching, that presence mattered. That sustained attention was its own form of statement, that you could say something to a thing you could not reach by refusing to stop looking at it. She stood at the entrance of the gap for a long time. Then she went home. She had not remarried. Several men had expressed interest over the years, and she had declined, because the explanation would have required her to describe things that did not fit the terms such explanations required. She left in 1881 for Tennessee. She was 57 years old. She went quietly, sold the property to a family who had no knowledge of its history. Before she left, she burned most of her papers, not the record. She left it in the desk of the farmhouse, perhaps because it belonged to the property more than to her, perhaps because she could not carry it alongside everything else she was carrying. Gus Merritt, the one person she said a real goodbye to, asked her if she had found peace with it, with Thomas, with the pass. She thought for a long moment. She said, "I found an understanding of it. Whether that's the same as peace, I'm not sure. I understand what the pass is, as well as I'm ever going to understand it. I don't think Thomas suffered. I think he went into something that wanted the particular weight of him, the particular forward motion of a man like Thomas pressing north into his life, and that whatever the taking was, it was complete. He was not diminished in the taking. He was taken whole." Gus said, "Do you believe that?" She said, "I believe it the way I believe any of the things I've arrived at about that gap. Not with certainty. With the conviction of someone who has thought about it longer and harder than anyone else. And this is where the thinking led." He said, "It's enough," she said. "It has to be. That's what enough means." They stood on her porch in the early morning light and looked north along the ridge. The gap was there in its crease in the limestone, dark against the pale autumn sky. The same route north that people continued to use, most of them passing through it with no awareness of what the cold section of the east wall held. Clara looked at it for the last time, not as a place that had wronged her, with the respect you gave a thing that was entirely itself, without apology, without accommodation to the people who moved through it. It was what it was. It had always been what it was. She turned from the gap and walked to the wagon, and did not look back. Clara Holt arrived in Tennessee in the autumn of 1881 and lived with her sister's family for the rest of her life. She died in 1904 at the age of 80. She was known in that community as a woman of unusual clarity and composure, someone whose steadiness people sought in difficult times without always being able to say why. She spoke rarely of Missouri. She did not speak of the past to anyone in Tennessee, except once, near the end of her life, when her grandniece asked her directly whether the stories about her husband's disappearance were true. She said, "They are true." The grandniece asked, "And you never found out what happened?" She said, "I found out as much as there was to find out. There are things in the world that don't reveal themselves to any amount of looking. The past was one of them. What I found was this. It took him completely. Whatever it took him for, it took all of him. He was not diminished in the taking." She said, "I watched the gap for 13 years, every evening. That is the thing people find strange. They think it was grief. They think I was waiting for him to come back." She said, "I was not waiting. I knew he was not coming back. I was watching because watching was the only thing I had to offer something I could not reach. The only language I had for a loss that had no language. You watch. You stay present. You do not look away." She said, "I do not regret it. Not the 13 years, not the watching, not the record I kept. I did not waste those years. I spent them on something true. That is not nothing." The grandniece was 22, and she sat with her great-aunt in the autumn afternoon and understood that she was being given something that mattered, though she could not yet say exactly what. She remembered it for the rest of her life. Several people who traveled the pass in the years after 1868 mentioned that there was a section of the east wall at the midpoint that felt different from the surrounding rock when you put your hand on it. Cold, deeper than the surface. Most mentioned it in passing as an interesting feature of the geology and moved on. One man, a surveyor working the county in the late 1870s, stopped and examined it carefully and wrote about it in his survey notes. He described the rock as normal limestone in every measurable property. He described the cold as present, but unaccountable. He wrote, "I am not a man given to unusual interpretations of natural features, but I found myself reluctant to remain in contact with this section of wall for more than a few seconds. Not from fear, exactly. From the sense of something adjacent, something close to ordinary but on the other side of a surface whose depth I could not determine." The notes were filed. The county records absorbed them. The cold in the wall does not go away. Some accounts from the 20th century, from people who have walked the old gap out of curiosity or historical interest, describe the same cold section, same location, same differential temperature, same quality of depth, the same sense, when you stand beside it with your hand on the stone, that the surface you are touching is close to something you cannot see from this side, that what lies beyond it is not empty, that something is there on the other side of the limestone, waiting with the patience of a thing that has been waiting since before patience was a concept anyone had named. Something that took 4 men on a November morning and left their horses at the gate. Something that a woman watched from her window for 13 years, evening after evening, in the last light. Not with anger, not with despair, with the particular quality of attention that is the only thing we have to offer the things we cannot reach. With presence, with the willingness to remain. The gap in the limestone is still there. The cold in the wall is still there. And somewhere on the other side of a surface whose thickness no one has ever measured, on a November morning that has not ended, 4 men ride north, complete, intact, entirely themselves.